Despite differences in language, immigrants had alcohol in common, and when the year of revolutions in 1848 sent so many good and decent Europeans fleeing to America, the immigrants escaping the old country for America brought plenty of cuttings over from their grapevines, but the cuttings failed to thrive, and the temperance people thought it was God's will that Europeans repeatedly failed to make better grapes grow in America. The Dutch had been the most successful at starting a colony in America, but when the English defeated Holland in 1664 and renamed the city of New York, erasing its name New Amsterdam, the word Dutch became a bad slang word for foreigner. The British Queen Anne of the House of Hanover offered free transportation to Germans willing to move to America in 1709. And the Queen wanted to get rid of the Germans who'd made their way to England after escaping the fighting between the Catholics and the Protestants in their home countries. And the founding of the new House of Hanover had encouraged them to seek refuge in England. When 13,000 of them had arrived in England, they had little left after the journey, and these Germans were living in the streets of London and Liverpool until the Queen decided that they could be shipped away, and some were sent to Ireland, but most made it to America. When they got to the New World, these German immigrants were called Newlanders and were auctioned off as indentured servants as soon as the ship docked, and the newspapers would carry advertisements about a shipload of Germans arriving for auction, and most would be sold into service before they were allowed off the boat. Even though some of the redemptioners fell into the hands of cruel, lecherous, or abusive employers, they were the lucky ones. The less fortunate were those who died on the voyage from Europe, or who were lost in the frequent shipwrecks. Many died of starvation or disease on the way over. The German Americans, An Informal History by Richard O'Connor, New York, Little Brown and Company, 1968, page 23. The Newlanders were packed onto ships almost as tightly as Africans, but were given a little more room because they usually had some luggage, having come from a colder climate. And one historian wrote that, quote, many immigrant vessels were lost at sea, and the shipwrecks went unreported out of fear that they might discourage other immigrants from Germany. The German Americans, Ibid. Shipping companies sent brightly painted wagons throughout Germany to advertise this free shipping deal, and they gave away free schnapps with their speeches about America, and when the Germans stepped on board they signed a piece of paper making them liable for the price of passage, which included the cost of any others who might die on the journey. When the ship docked in America, many Germans were indebted for life, and the U.S. Congress finally passed a law allowing the immigrants to sue the ship's captain for ill treatment, and in 1819 Congress limited the number of passengers per tonnage, which put an end to the shipping company's profits. Immigration laws had been basically against Catholics, and nobody minded trying to exclude them because it was believed that they took orders from Rome before America, and that belief was exacerbated by the reality that Italy figured that once an Italian, always an Italian, so the government of Italy wanted to be able to call back all Italian Americans for military service whenever it became necessary. More Germans came over in the 1840s and showed Americans how to make better beer, and St. Louis became the beer capital of the nation and had its own newspaper printed in the German language, and Nebraska had too. Miller was originally Müller, and then came Schlitz and Budweiser, and there were also Pabst and Blatz who were brewing beer, and the temperance people thought Mr. Anheuser-Busch was a German Hun who wanted to corrupt the morality of innocent Americans. The U.S. Marines were sent into Brooklyn in 1869 to destroy distilleries refusing to pay taxes, and 800 men with fixed bayonets fought back a mob protecting the liquor factories, and Colonel George Custer was sent into Kentucky to destroy moonshine stills in 1871. The Prohibition Party started in 1868. and they had a candidate in every election for the next 12 terms. And Kansas was the first state to go dry in 1880, and so Dorothy had to run away from Kansas. There were 7 dry states by 1900, but going dry meant only that the sale of alcohol was banned, not home manufacture or consumption, and the better off could still stock their wet bars with alcohol delivered from neighboring states. The dry people got together and took over the shipping companies and the steamboats and the canal lines, and Temperance became an economic powerhouse. And when innkeepers complained that they couldn't make any money unless they sold alcohol, the Temperance people relented and opened their own dry public inns. Carrie Nation's first husband would go to his Masonic lodge and drink, and Masonic lodges were a good place to drink alcohol, while neglected wives gossiped about the satanic activities going on at the Masonic meetings. In the old country, the best kind of building material was called freestone, and it was a kind of rock that didn't chip or splinter when it was cut, and the masons cutting the freestone out of the quarry were called freestone masons, which was shortened to Freemasons, and the Masonic lodges were great places for their members to gather around alcohol. In 1913, less than 1% of women had jobs outside the home, while people were drinking more because machines allowed them more time to drink, and factories were making alcohol instead of small batches on farms using leftover grain. The Temperance people still considered beer to be a healthful drink, different from the alcohol found in gin or whiskey, and beer was called liquid bread, while distilled spirits were said to be the cause of debauchery and sinfulness, so husbands began to drink their whiskey out of the presence of the ladies. It was easy for Carrie Nation to cause a fuss over alcohol because speaking on a soapbox in public was the only entertainment around before television and radio, and one of Edison's first films showed a scene of Carrie Nation breaking up a bar with her axe, and Carrie Nation wasn't sent to jail very often because the people would be admitting that there were a lot of bars around for her to ransack. Alcohol factories turned liquor into something produced in other states or countries, rather than being a local neighborhood product. And factories made cities grow because people working in them had to live nearby the factory, and immigrants went to the cities where they could live around people who spoke their own language. Congress passed a law in 1882 charging 50 cents per head to get into America, and that suddenly made more people want to come over because it was seen as a paid-for privilege rather than as a punishment or an exile. The first immigrants had come from the Scandinavian countries and from Germany, France, England, and Holland, and after 1889, more came from Lower Europe and the Slavic companies of Italy, Sicily, Serbia, and Russia. In the 1880s, 20% had come from the lower countries, and then half in the 1890s, and 3/4 by 1910. And lawmakers found out that immigration issues got them votes, so Congress started making arguments about immigration and declared that by 1890, the American frontier had been all gone. Immigration peaked out at 1,300,000 in 1907, and America cut back on immigration in 1921 because people decided, thanks to the Italians, that only criminals and paupers were coming over from Europe, and few people knew that Christopher Columbus had been an Italian. Temperance societies gave people a reason to gather together and listen to fiery speeches, and one of the major themes was independence, with drinkers said to be in bondage to the bottle while the temperance people were truly free. Temperance became very patriotic, and sobriety was taught in schools like the Hitler Youth, and giving up alcohol was said to be like getting rid of Britain, and they would read the Declaration of Independence substituting Prince Alcohol for King George, and the temperance people convinced farmers to cut down their apple trees by telling them that the apple had been Adam's downfall. Because the temperance promoters were mostly people of leisure, with the time and money to pursue their liberal fantasies, the reality of the work done in mines and mills and factories and slaughterhouses was unknown to the temperance pushers, and Rorabaugh said that by 1839 a large majority of the doctors and ministers had become teetotalers, and their children were just desperate to go west to find a drink. The Pacific Northwest was the place to go, where the tradition of drinking was still strong, and the lumberjacks were leading the parade. Asylums were built for the incapacitated, and some of these institutions allowed people to come and go freely, while others were more like prisons. And in England, the British Poor Law of 1834 built workhouses in England for the poor that were intentionally cruel and miserable in order to discourage people from being poor. The Corn Laws were supposed to keep up the price of English corn and wheat using stiff tariffs on the corn and wheat grown by slaves in the American South, but with the higher price of corn and wheat in England, it became a hardship on the common Englishmen to brew their own alcohol from corn and wheat, so they began using potatoes, and that put a hardship on the Irish. Vodka was made from potatoes, but Russians didn't grow potatoes until the time of Catherine the Great, who was a German. And when she brought potatoes to Russia, they called it devil's weed because it was so hard to get rid of after planting. The English bought potatoes from the Belgians, who'd gotten a load of potatoes from America, contaminated with blight, and those diseased potatoes found their way into Ireland in 1843, or so the story goes, in trying to blame America for what was clearly a British problem. And when the British commissioners finally made their way northward to find out why the Irish were starving, the Crown thought the Irish were making vodka instead of having suffered potato blight, and the English refused to help feed the starving Irish, which forced them to immigrate to America after the Great Potato Famine of 1845. The Great Chartist Uprising was just one of many in the year of revolutions in 1848. And while many historians thought the year of revolutions had begun with the Italians, it had actually begun with the Irish moving to America and spreading the word that the New World was now leaving the Old World behind. Immigrants were smaller and shorter than people in America who had lived with access to more food, having come over out of that hunger which would make people do just about anything. And Americans heard rumors of cannibalism back home in their home countries. Americans heard rumors of cannibalism back in their home countries. With the new science of eugenics, the U.S. government explained that the smaller immigrants were genetically inferior and passed laws about marriage and promoted sterilization, not wanting Americans to get smaller by breeding with the immigrants. Britain had offloaded their poor to America because they believed poverty to be of genetic origin, but that getting rid of genetically poor England by shipping them to the American colonies was in Britain's best interests.